Hirlock, I'm very happy to be given the opportunity to speak in this debate. Statements on the role of journalists in conflict zones. In this House of our peaceful democracy, we weave in and out of the corridors, intermingling with journalists working freely in this democratic House, working freely to report and to analyse, to critique and reflect to those outside in an honest way, to report faithfully on the facts in front of them. And we're privileged to live in such a society. It's a huge responsibility, of course, for journalists too, to report faithfully and to acknowledge errors if and where they occur. Surely that's everyone's responsibility, but particularly those in whom faith is placed to report accurately. But because of that privilege that we all share, we take time today to reflect on those less fortunate, those living and working in war, and particularly those who try to faithfully report the honest truth to the outside. The role of journalists and their support teams, camera people, producers, editors, is so important to those of us who will hopefully never experience conflict in ways that we've seen in the likes of Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, Israel, Iraq, and so many other places. And if the work of journalists is generally is fundamental to the democratic state, it's even more important in situations of conflict to tell the individual stories of war. And I want to acknowledge the sheer bravery of those people to willingly go into such dangerous situations to tell us the stories of conflict so that we're not ignorant to the struggles faced by so many across the world. An academic study in 2009 published in the Media, War and Conflict Journal highlighting the increasing common violence against journalists over the previous 2 decades, a trend that has not abated since. And we see that the Committee on the Protection of Journalists, a press protection movement, reports that 2 journalists were killed during the First World War, 66 killed in the Vietnam conflict. And in more recent conflict from Bosnia to Sierra Leone to Afghanistan, we've seen multiple instances of insurgents deliberately targeting journalists being reported. The trend was even more disturbing in Iraq. Since the war began in Iraq in March 2003 up to 2008, more than 127 journalists and media workers were killed while on assignment, and that's clearly out of date. I note from the report by Reporters Without Borders that between 300 and 700 journalists were killed in airstrikes or executed since 2011 in Syria. And of course, it's really not possible to confirm an exact number due for so many reasons: lack of record keeping, lack of transparency. But such a high number shocked me, in the course of examining this in preparation for these statements. And I feel that we don't hear enough about this generally across the world. That number doesn't even include the number of journalists arrested or abducted or missing in the course of their work. And of course, the increased demand for on-the-ground news coverage of war has made journalists a target for increased attacks, and the blurring of lines between war and terrorism has led to previous international conventions on the protection of journalists being ignored, resulting in increased endangerment. We've seen that the Committee on the Protection of Journalists has reported journalists murdered in war are often killed in acts of reprisal, or in order to prevent them from successfully reporting on conflict, because of course the key role that journalists play. There are 3 journalists who have died recently I want to highlight today, and then I'd like to speak about the day-to-day realities of reporting on conflict. The death last week of Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank in Israel is the most recent tragic death in a long list of journalists who have given their lives for their work in the West Bank. She was a brilliant and effective journalist killed in the course of her work. And I'd also like to mention another journalist, Ali Al-Samoud, who was wounded in the attack that killed Miss Abu Akleh. In my own constituency earlier this year, we had the profound loss of that of Pierre Zakrzewski, a cameraman who had covered conflict across the Middle East, Asia and Africa before his untimely death in Ukraine. It was very early on in Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine, where once again we were entirely reliant on journalists for hourly updates on the ground, first-hand accounts of the cruelty and devastation. And at home here in Ireland, 2 journalists have been killed due to and in the course of their work. Just 3 years ago, we saw the tragic death of Lyra McKee, murdered while observing riots in Northern Ireland, and a stark reminder of how hard we need to maintain peace, how hard we need to work to maintain peace on this island. And of course, we cannot speak on this subject in this House without remembering the death of Veronica Guerin in 1996 for her work reporting on drug and gang-related crimes in Ireland, not directly within the terms of this debate, but really her bravery was no different to those mentioned before. There are so many journalists who have been killed. The world saw this so acutely in 2002 with the very vivid death when the Wall Street Journal journalist Daniel Pearl, who was investigating Al-Qaeda at the time, was captured and beheaded in Pakistan in 2002. And there are so many, many others that can be mentioned, Cahirlock. And you'll note that I just tried to focus on the journalists themselves and the course of their work without trying to attribute blame in any particular way, but just simply acknowledge the difficulty of the work that they're doing. I think it's really important to focus on their work, not just their deaths as well. And work today is ongoing in Ukraine in particular that is beyond brave. On the day that Ukraine was invaded on February 24th, I had a topical issue with the Minister Simon Coveney on the invasion of Ukraine and what we as a country could do to be supportive. And it was my privilege on that day to be able to welcome my friend, a Ukrainian, and her family into the gallery. and to meet Minister Coveney following the debate. But crucially, her brother is Vitaly Sik, who's chief editor of New Voice of Ukraine, which is a leading newspaper. And on that day 3 months ago, she didn't know whether or not he would survive the conflict. And she was worried that he would be particularly targeted due to his work as a journalist. A decade earlier, a friend of theirs, also a journalist, had been killed by Russians. But in spite of that fear, Vitaly has continued to speak out and be extremely vocal on the Russian invasion. He's still there, and just 2 days ago he was speaking to CNN following his return to Kyiv from Lviv, the state of the streets, the remnants and damage caused by street fighting in the main city, and he spoke of people returning to their homes to find them broken into, looted. And I'd like to read an extract from his blog from Ukraine, which is on atlanticcouncil.org, if that's okay, just to describe the reality of what he's doing on a day-to-day basis here. When my wife hurriedly woke me in the early hours of February 24 and I looked out the window, I couldn't believe my eyes. The familiar panoramic view from our apartment on the 20th floor overlooking the Dnipro River was now dotted with huge columns of black smoke. Our entire building was shaking from explosions as missiles rained down on the outskirts of Kyiv. The unthinkable had happened. Even though we all knew Russia had amassed a huge army on the Ukrainian border, I remained convinced until the very last moment that it was all a geopolitical bluff. Like so many Ukrainians, I could not believe anyone would launch a full-scale military invasion in the centre of Europe. Such things did simply not happen anymore, not in 2022. I grabbed my phone and was immediately confronted by footage of Russian President Vladimir Putin proclaiming the start of a special military operation in Ukraine. His speech was completely unhinged and full of wild historical distortions. This is war, I said to my wife. For weeks I had downplayed her concerns about a possible war, often while gently teasing her and making sarcastic remarks. Despite my apparent confidence, my wife had remained unconvinced. She kept the tank of the car full, even purchasing and filling an extra petrol canister. She packed changes of clothes and personal documents for the family and bought lots of dry food. I thought it was over the top and said so, but sadly she turned out to be right. The day had barely begun, but already it was time to get our 8-year-old twins, Peter and Anna, out of the city. We'd read numerous reports from the British and US intelligence services describing in detail how Russian security forces had compiled kill lists of Ukrainian journalists, activists and politicians hostile to Moscow who were to be rounded up and executed during the initial stages of the occupation. My wife and I knew my name must be somewhere on those lists. A brief look at my Facebook profile or a glance through the magazine I managed would be enough to get me into trouble with the Russians. My magazine's last cover page, before we were forced to suspend publication due to the war, had featured Putin alongside senile Russian dictators Lenin and Stalin. All three were portrayed in wheelchairs styled to evoke a well-known Soviet photo of Lenin's last days. The headline read, "Kremlin Madhouse." This was entirely in keeping with the spirit of the publication, and it was clearly unwise for us to stay in Kyiv. After more than 3 days of non-stop driving, that felt like 3 weeks, we finally reached the border. Our farewells were mercifully short. As we kissed and hugged our goodbyes, I had no idea if I would ever see my family again. They crossed into Slovakia and were finally safe. A week later, the Irish Times would publish an article about my family's escape, headlined, "Now we have a chance to cry." Those two children, Peter and Anna, were until recently in school in Dundrum. And I think they have to return now to Ukraine because of the decisions of the Ukrainian government that state employees have to return to work or else forfeit their positions. So these are the incredibly difficult decisions that not just journalists are having to make, but their families are having to make on a day-to-day basis. These are the realities of conflict. Vitaly, of course, remained on the Ukrainian side of the border entirely alone. Like everyone else there, he was facing a future of uncertainty, and he returned to Lviv and his wartime life began. He describes then how, living in Lviv, he was living in an apartment with his magazine partner and got a text message asking if he was still alive. He said he immediately understood that the noise that had woken me up was the sound of Russian ballistic missiles. I peered out of my window and saw smoke rising from somewhere in the downtown area of Lviv. 5 Russian missiles had hit the city, leaving 7 dead and dozens wounded. This was the 3rd Russian airstrike on Lviv, a city close to the EU border that is generally regarded as safe. "Are we going to do our radio show today?" I asked Serhiy. "Why not?" he replied. So we did. And since settling in Lviv during the early days of the war, we have broadcast more than 40 episodes of the show. We go on air every day, always around lunchtime. He talks as well about the location problem that he has for living and also doing his work. As with all real estate, he makes the observation that location is the most important feature, but in his case, this is definitely a problem. The apartment they're renting is close to a huge military base, and it's on the top floor. And he says the threat of Russian airstrikes are no longer hypothetical. Indeed, the ambassador of Kazakhstan was living just a few blocks away until recently, but advised by his security team to move out of the neighbourhood. This apparent danger is a source of amusement to locals. When they find out where we live, the joke is our landlord should actually be paying us. To make matters worse, as I've said, the apartment is on the top floor of the building. There have been several deadly Russian missile strikes that killed dozens of Ukrainian soldiers in the area, and sirens go off in the city and everybody knows how to react now. But what Vitaly has done now is move back to Kyiv, move back with his family there, and it is, I just wanted to highlight what he's doing as an example of the role of journalists in conflict situations and the challenges that they face day to day. It's such an important thing to reflect upon, but it's important to reflect on it not just in Ukraine, not just in Israel, not just in Iraq, but around the world, around the globe. These are the same challenges faced in conflict zones by all journalists, and we have to commend their bravery today.